Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for joining Target Test Prep's webinar today on your round one MBA countdown. So we're going to be running through quite a bit of content, everything you need to know about round one and beyond. And as I mentioned, we really like to try and tailor these webinars to questions that are going to be specific and content that's specific to you. So again, please feel free to drop in the chat where you're joining from today, which round you're thinking about, and maybe which schools you're thinking about as well. So just a bit of an intro. My name is Joanna Graham. I have been in the admissions and academic world for over 20 years. I spent about a decade working for the Graduate Management Admission Council, where I was the product manager for the GMAT, and have also worked as a chief marketing and product officer at a variety of other education organizations, as well as in the tech sector. So I'm delighted to be joining you all today. I've been working with clients for over 20 years now on MBA applications. It is something that I absolutely love doing as a marketing professional. It really it brings me a lot of joy to be able to work with folks to try to help them sort of unlock their stories and really sort of think about how to present themselves to a competitive business school. So today, what we're going to be talking about is many of you probably know, if you're in the throngs of round one applications. Round one applications are just around the corner. So today is going to be a bit of a wrap up on everything you need to know going into round one. But not to fear, I see a lot of folks joining today are thinking about round two. And so we'll definitely be talking a little bit about what are some of the things you need to be considering if you're thinking about applying round one versus round two, but also just things that are going to be helpful, obviously, at any step in the process. So I do want to just mention Target Test Prep is it really does offer quite a variety of different services. So it is a very much sort of your one-stop shop for your entire graduate management education journey. It started as a test prep company. So as you can see, GMAT Focus and GRE Prep, although actually we should probably update that now. I believe now it has gone back to being GMAT. So it's no longer GMAT Focus. But we really sort of built our brand and built our following on our competencies in the test prep space. And so whether you're thinking about self-study courses, live courses, or tutoring, TTP definitely has a service for you and has a package that'll fit you. And then, as I mentioned, admissions consulting is something that we added within the last year. So there is a team of admissions consultants, including myself, obviously, who work with clients directly. And as you can see, in a variety of different ways. So everything from comprehensive school packages, which, as the name might suggest, includes everything related to your MBA application or your graduate management program application. So everything from school strategy, school engagement, essays, letters of recommendation, resume work, you name it, and obviously interview prep as well. For those who are thinking that they want more specialized prep or more specific prep, hourly is a great option, as well as some of our a la carte options that you can see here, some of our more popular services. So application review, especially if you're thinking about round one and want to get a set of eyes on your application from someone who actually has worked in an admissions office and has read applications. Application review is a great opportunity to have someone review your entire application and provide comprehensive feedback on your application. Mock interview prep, including specifically Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, is something that we offer as well once those invitations come out. So do keep that in mind as well. And then ding strategy, I know that's something that folks don't necessarily like to talk about, but if round one doesn't necessarily go the way that you're hoping and you want to regroup before you head into round two application potentially, that's a great opportunity to get some feedback on your application and how you might be able to optimize moving into future rounds. For any folks who are still enrolled in an undergrad program, 2+2 or deferred MBA program strategy is certainly something that we specialize in as well. We had a couple of clients we worked with this previous cycle who were incredibly successful with deferred entry programs. So it's something that we really encourage folks to think about as well. And then last but not least, a mentorship bundle. So as you can probably imagine, folks are applying to business schools earlier and earlier, but it also is never too early to get started thinking about what types of things you may want to do earlier in the process if you're thinking about business school down the road. And so we do offer coaching and mentorship packages as well. Sorry, I got a little excited with the mouse. Apologies. So a quick agenda for today. So we'll do a quick overview of holistic admissions. It's probably a term that many of you have heard. We'll talk a little bit about what that actually means through an admissions lens. We'll spend some time talking about round one versus round two strategy. So what should you be thinking about if you're thinking about round one specifically, or how to split up your applications across round one and round two? And then we'll run through a pretty comprehensive application checklist. So we'll break down every piece of the application and talk about what are the things that you need to be thinking about right now. And again, if you have specific questions about some of those application elements, we can certainly get to that at the end. And then finally, we'll start talking a little bit about early interview prep. So what are some of the things, even though your applications aren't even submitted yet, but as you're working on your application, what are some of the things that you can do to start sort of actively preparing for the interview process? And then finally, we'll wrap up with some quick do's and don'ts, and then we will turn it over to you. And hopefully we should have about 15, 20 minutes open and available for Q&A. So let's start with an overview of holistic admissions, and really, I think more importantly, this idea of fit, which I'm sure you've probably heard schools talk about quite a bit. As you can imagine, the most important thing that schools are going to be looking at is your professional experience. There's a reason why schools are looking for, on average, individuals with 3 to 7 years of work experience. When you think about the value that you're going to derive from a program, and when schools are thinking about the cohorts that they want to put together, a big component of this is thinking about the experiences that individuals are going to bring to the classroom. So it's one thing to talk about accounting or finance or marketing through a very academic textbook lens. It's another thing to talk about the real life scenarios that you have actually faced in your professional career and how that conversation can certainly help others within your cohort grow. Again, through that lens of academia, obviously, but applying that real world spin is something that creates incredibly valuable conversation in the classroom. And so schools are going to be looking for, again, that professional experience, ideally 3 to 7 years for most. I have worked with clients as many who have had less experience, who have had more experience, as have many of my colleagues. I think a lot of this is really, designed to really evaluate and sort of look at what is the quality of your experience. And so if you have fewer than 3 years of work experience, thinking about what have you actually accomplished in that time in the workplace? What types of results have you been able to drive? What have you learned? Have you been able to grow and potentially be promoted? And likewise, if you're if you're closer towards the right side of that bell curve, if you're talking about someone who has 8 or 9 years of experience, but you're not necessarily thinking about an executive MBA, why a full-time program? Why an MBA right now? And what are you going to do with that degree? So really trying to think about how do you position all of that professional experience so that schools understand where the MBA fits into that journey. The next piece is going to be academics. So schools want to see, did you challenge yourself as an undergrad? If you have an undergrad degree and a master's, what type of curriculum did you pursue? How did you do in the classroom? For folks maybe who didn't do quite as well in their undergrad program, you're certainly not alone, number one. But number two, I think it's really important to think about how you talk about or how you position some of those pieces of your story. One of the things also to think about, if you do have a master's degree, if that master's degree GPA is higher than your undergrad GPA, that's certainly a data point that will help. And obviously, the one thing I will say too is, as you think about other types of programs, I know most folks here, I think, are thinking about full-time. I saw a couple of folks who are thinking about executive. If you are thinking, though, primarily full-time, obviously you're going to be a little bit less removed from that undergrad experience, but the further removed you are from your undergrad experience, I would say I don't want to say it's less important, but it does become a little bit less significant because you're obviously a very different version of yourself 10 years, 12 years removed from an undergrad program than you were, say, 2 or 3 years removed. And so the role of your undergrad GPA, the role of academics is certainly going to evolve depending on your unique and individual situation. Next, test scores. So this can be, honestly, we could probably spend a whole webinar on this. In fact, I know TTP has. But when you think about the role of test scores, and I can tell you right now, as someone who owned the GMAT for 10 years, it's, the testing piece is very interesting. It's the one piece of your application that you really can directly control and influence, first of all. So for folks who have a lower GPA, one of the common questions is, what do I need to get on one of these tests to actually boost my chances? So one of the ways to think about this really is, there isn't necessarily a magic formula, although I would encourage you to take a look at what the average GMAT and GRE scores are at the programs that you're interested in. And if your undergrad GPA falls below the average, it's probably a safe bet to assume that your GMAT or GRE score needs to work a little bit harder for you, particularly if you don't have a lot of quant experience, or perhaps if your undergrad major was in a quant-based field. In this case, you just want to make sure that your test score is working a little bit harder for you and to set appropriate goals in that regard. For those who are not familiar with the EA is the executive assessment. It was designed by GMAT to be leveraged by executive MBA programs, but more and more it is being adopted by full-time programs as well. So that's always something for you to think about as well. It is shorter. It is a bit more expensive, but many folks do like it because it is significantly shorter than the GMAT exam itself. For extracurricular activities and community service, so we'll kind of bundle these two together. Really, I'm sure for anyone who went to an undergrad program here in the US, you probably remember having to fill out a long list of all of your extracurricular activities from high school or secondary school, all of your volunteer work. And while there isn't a nice, neat list or checklist for on MBA applications, this is something that schools want to see. How involved have you been in your wider community? Or perhaps within your company, if there are affinity groups or maybe other pieces that are not just your daily job that you're able to contribute to. And the reason for extracurriculars, I get this question a lot from folks. The reason why there is such an emphasis on community service and extracurricular activities is schools really want to see number one, what are you excited about and passionate about? But number two, where are you choosing to spend your time when you're not doing the things that you have to do? So when you're not doing the just your job things, how do you choose to spend your free time? Because that really is going to give a school signal about how you're going to choose to show up on their campus within their community. Are you going to be someone who just shows up, goes to class, clocks in, clocks out, goes to the library? Or are you someone who's going to really lean into student activities and clubs, into the wider community? Are you someone who really is thinking about how are you going to leave the school and the wider community a better place than you found it? And that's a really big piece of the MBA experience as well. And so that's what schools are looking to gauge. How involved are you going to be? How passionate are you? And also, again, more importantly, where are some of your passions? And especially for folks who are thinking about pivoting from one career pathway or one industry into another one. So if you're thinking about going from finance into consulting, or if you're thinking about moving maybe from consulting into the social impact or NGO space, the extracurriculars and community service can really be a great opportunity for you to show and sort of validate your interest in some of these other new areas. And so I would encourage you, depending on where you are in the process, if you do have a little bit more time, if you are able to add some activities that really validate whatever it is you're going to be doing in the future beyond your MBA life, that is certainly a great place for you to start showing schools sort of what that interest is and how you're actually going to live that. Very much in line with this, and this is probably me putting on my CMO hat, alignment with the school's mission and values is going to be incredibly important as well. And what this really means is, obviously it's not to say that that there's a sort of a special type of accounting or statistics or finance that's being taught at Columbia as opposed to Berkeley. But when you think about sort of what a school offers, the differentiators truly are going to be when you think about their mission and values. And so I always tell folks, when you start reading about schools, it's not like there's some special magic fairy dust that was sprinkled on the accounting that they teach at one school that isn't at another. But when you think about how the school teaches some of these core concepts, when you think about their values, when you think about their mission, that starts to create a slightly different lens in terms of the way that things are taught. But more importantly, it really now starts to put a slightly different spin on just the overall educational and MBA experience. And so when you start thinking about your fit with a particular program, a great place to get started is really taking a look at what a school's mission statement is saying about the institution. What are the values that they espouse and how do they live those values? And then looking at your own personal life and your professional experience and seeing how your professional experience and additional activities align with just that, with the school's mission, with their value set, and how you're able to make those connections. All of this combined, really starts to build what we call a distinct point of view or POV. And in many cases, you can also sort of define that as a personal brand or profile. I'm always careful about using that term because I don't necessarily want folks to think that they have to manicure or create this perfectly manicured brand or image of themselves. That sort of is a bit of a distraction, but rather it's thinking about what are the things that you have done and how can you choose to talk about them in a very distinct way through a very distinct lens that's going to make you stand out. And this is all going to come to life through your essays, through your letters of recommendation, through the interview as well. And then finally, there's this wonderful bucket of things that we like to call soft skills. So these are all the things that don't fit in all of these wonderful, nice, neat check boxes necessarily. But these are the things like intellectual curiosity, leadership skills, grit, resilience. I'm sure many of you have heard schools talking about the ability to evaluate leadership potential, and that's what they're looking for in their future cohorts. So what type of leader are you going to be? All of these things are going to be things that I would encourage, I would encourage you to, number one, think about how you live all of these and how you sort of embrace all of these soft skills. But more importantly, especially as you start thinking about things like your letters of recommendation, many of these skill grids that schools ask recommenders to fill out are going to be asking them to evaluate you on various soft skills. So starting to think very actively about what are the soft skills that you feel you really sort of excel in, and using this as an opportunity to tee this up with some of the folks writing your letters of recommendation, providing specific examples about how you sort of live out these skills and how you demonstrate them is going to be a huge advantage to you as well. So again, starting to think early and often about soft skills and how you incorporate them in every piece of your application is going to be huge. And then finally, the interview. And we'll talk a little bit about interviews later on, so I won't spend too much time here. But the interview, again, is really an opportunity more so to bring your application to life. So if an admissions committee likes what they see in your application and they want to sort of see a more three-dimensional version of you and sort of breathe some life into everything that you've talked about, the interview obviously is going to be a great place for that. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about timelines here. And so when you start thinking really about sort of application strategy, I recognize that there are a couple of other rounds and other sort of timelines or timetables in addition to round one versus round two. So, but for the purpose of this discussion, we'll talk a little bit about round one versus round two, recognizing there are things like rolling admission, a couple of programs like Duke are going to have early action, and then a handful of programs obviously have round three and beyond as well. But again, really the bulk of the applications that schools see are going to typically come in across round one or round two. So a lot of folks will sometimes talk about sort of the round one advantage. And what I want to say here, number one, is that, there are a handful of schools like HBS that are going to take the same number of applicants or the same number of students in round one as opposed to round two. But when people think about the round one versus round two sort of advantage here, there are a couple of things that you want to consider. In many cases, round one sort of gives you what folks refer to as first movers advantage. So you're part of that first cohort of applicants, that first batch of applications that an admissions committee is going to see. And they don't necessarily know who's going to be applying in round two. And so if they see someone who looks great on paper, who interviews well, that may give you a little bit of an extra edge. If you're that person maybe who waits until round two to apply, and there's someone very similar to you who has applied in round one and been admitted, there may not be space for someone with your type of profile. And so it is really important to sort of weigh those options as you think about round one versus round two. One of the biggest conversations that I have with clients that I work with is around how many applications should you be submitting per round. And really, in the big question of when do you actually push applications to the next round? And so, as you can see, I've got a snapshot here of round one deadlines for a handful of programs. As you can see, they are spread out. They are pretty much spread out really evenly across about a 30-day period. What I do encourage clients to think about, number one, is, many folks come to the table and say, hey, I'm putting in all my applications in round one. And that is a fantastic goal to have. It's nice to be able to be done. And then you can certainly have everything, have all of your applications in one application pool. One of the things that to really consider is, number one, a lot of these applications, even though the questions can often be similar, are going to require quite a bit of reflection, quite a bit of research, so that you can customize your essays and your responses for those particular schools. And that process, I will tell you right now, typically takes much longer than people expect. I have clients I'm working with right now on round one applications where we've been working together since late spring, early summer. And we are starting to have some of those conversations about do we push some applications to round two, because the amount of time that it takes to really research these schools well is oftentimes, I think folks sometimes underestimate how much that will take. And so one of the things to think about is when you are putting your school list together. So for folks who are thinking about round two, if you're starting to work on your school list, make sure that you're prioritizing that school list. So if you're thinking that you have 7 to 10 schools that you're interested in, hear them out. So, these are my top three. These are my sort of my second three, and then the last three are my, are the final four coming in, and prioritize the work that you're doing based on those schools. And so, similarly for round one, folks, if candidates come in with a list of 7 or 8 schools that they're interested in applying to over the course of the application cycle, we prioritize them into 2 buckets, and we choose to focus on those first 3 or 4. And then knowing that once those applications are probably are in a good space, and whether that's an 80 or 90% solution, then we can start adding additional applications into the mix as well. There certainly are going to be schools that are going to be similar in nature where you can probably combine some of this work. And so some of the positioning that you use could certainly be recycled. But I would encourage you to think, if there are schools, for example, the Stanford application is going to be incredibly different from the Wharton application. Wharton's going to be incredibly different from many other schools as well too. You don't necessarily want to be doing all of those applications at the same time in a vacuum. It's good to at least get a head start and really start sort of thinking about what types of elements are going to be important and going to be crucial in order to make that Wharton application stand out. Obviously, if you want to make sure that you're conveying that you are going to be able to handle the rigor of quant and of finance as a first year at Wharton, in addition to a variety of other things. But for example, if you're thinking about Stanford or HBS, you want to make sure that you are leaving room for some of that additional color commentary to talk about your story that you might not necessarily be able to include in some of your other applications. So really understanding what are the important things that schools are going to be looking for in those applications, and figuring out sort of how to group some of those after sort of applying that first initial sort of lens or filter based on what you truly are looking for. I think the $1 million question here for a lot of folks is often, when do I push applications to the next round? And what I would say to you is, I would say for any of the schools that we have listed here, there really isn't much of a margin for error. And so I encourage folks to really think, once you get to about 30 days out. So for some of these schools like Wharton and HBS, we're coming up close on this, really taking a hard look at your applications and your essays, and thinking about, do I feel like I'm going to get to a 100% solution by the time the deadline comes around? If 30 days out, you are still researching fellowship programs, you're still researching coursework, you're still researching sort of the value proposition of a particular school, it's going to be really tricky to get to that to that admissions deadline with a complete package. Because again, the research is just one part of it. You still have to reflect and think about how you're going to fit your own story to that to that framework, and then actually put pen to paper and figure out how you're going to tell that story in your personal statement. The other piece here too is when you think about letters of recommendation for a lot of these programs. Obviously, if you're applying round one, you should have already asked your letter writers for letters of recommendation, but really trying to think about how are you piecing together your application holistically. So what are the stories and what are the examples that you want your letter writers to include or to mention in their letters, versus what are you choosing to talk about in your personal statement or in your supplemental essays? Really taking the time to map that out and thinking about how this is all going to fit together. Number one, takes some time, but number two is going to be something that you want to do well in advance. So for anyone thinking about applying to round one, those are some of the things that I would encourage you to start thinking about. One of the other things that you may want to think about as well too is, number one, depending on the level of competition, and also sort of in that same vein and thinking about who you're competing against, if there are significant things that are going to change in your profile or in your application between round one and round two, that may be something to consider as well. For some folks, that's something as basic or foundational as having extra time to prepare for the GMAT or the GRE or the executive assessment. For other folks, one of the big things that you come up against is that there are oftentimes promotion cycles that happen in the fall. And so if you are up for a promotion, or if you're fairly certain you're going to be promoted during the fall cycle, how does that sort of factor into the equation? And so one of the things I would encourage you to think about is, number one, take a look at your body of work already when you think about sort of your professional experience. And number one, have you already been promoted in this current, in your current organization, or have you taken on additional responsibility? If the promotion does happen, how does your resume change? So what are going to be the bullet points? What are 2 or 3 of the new bullet points that you're going to be adding to your resume to reflect that additional responsibility? is there fiscal management responsibility that you'll have? Is there personnel management responsibility that you're going to have? Is there a particular project or initiative that you may own? Will you have P&L responsibilities? So really trying to think about how does your resume change and evolve to sort of reflect the additional responsibilities that come with that promotion is going to be really important. The other thing to think about too is, depending on the cycle and depending on those dates, you may want to think also about, when the interview invitations come out, is this something you could potentially talk about in the interview as well, or send as an update? And so again, think about the magnitude of scale when it comes to that promotion, and really sort of what that's going to look like for you as well. Again, those are probably there are a lot of other factors that sort of go into thinking about round one versus round two, but those are probably two of the more popular questions that I get from folks. Again, particularly around promotion cycles, but also thinking as well about just sort of what your application is going to look like sort of towards the end, and then finally the testing question. One of the things I do want to mention really quickly about testing as well, because folks ask this all the time: can you apply to a program with one test score and then submit an updated test score down the road? And for many programs, you certainly can. So you can certainly submit a test score that you have, and then if you are able to test and increase that score before interview invitations come out, you can always send that updated score to a program. It is obviously a little bit of a calculated risk, or a little bit of a gamble, but it is certainly something that I do encourage folks to think about as they sort of evaluate their entire profile. So let's talk a little bit about our application checklist. So we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive here, sort of into what some of the other things you want to be thinking about. So school research and visits are obviously going to be a big piece of this. As I mentioned before, the research piece is huge when it comes to really customizing your application and being able to articulate what the value that a program brings to your particular career pathway or journey, as well as the value that you're going to bring to them. One of the things that I do encourage folks to think about with regards to research and visits, there are a couple of different ways to approach this. So number one, with regards to school research, definitely think about sort of the role that school visits are going to play. So potentially, if you are planning or carving out time for school visits, certainly make sure that you're prioritizing the programs that are at the top of your list, number one. Number two, there is, as many of you know, there's no lack sort of school sort of tour events during the summer and the fall. And so I think those, in many ways, those events are great because you do get a chance to meet with representatives from multiple schools in one particular setting. So it gives you a chance to learn much more about schools in a singular setting, but also potentially learn about other schools maybe that aren't on your radar. It's also a great way to potentially connect with current students or alumni, since many of the schools will oftentimes have an admissions representative, but they'll also have local students or alumni from that city attending those events as well. This is also a chance for you to start thinking about how to tap into your network as well. Again, I really encourage folks to think about, when you think about sort of culture and fit, certainly you're not trying to make yourself look like people who have been accepted into programs, or mirror their application or mirror their story by any means. But as you start thinking about what the MBA journey is going to look like, I think a really important piece of this is really thinking about how have others sort of tapped into what that experience particularly is at a university. And so again, this is a great way to start trying to connect with alumni through your network, whether it's networking with folks in your place where you currently work, or tapping into your broader network via LinkedIn or one of these platforms, but really spending some time trying to connect with folks who have either followed similar pathways or who have just completed an MBA program at that particular school, understanding what their experience was like, what maybe some of the potential challenges and unanticipated challenges were that they faced, can certainly be valuable. But again, trying to schedule as many of these sort of virtual coffee chats as you possibly can is certainly going to be valuable. I do encourage folks to not get too hung up though on scheduling meetings with too many students. And what I mean by that is there's so much to do in order to prepare your own application. Don't over-index on spending too much time talking to as many people as possible that your own application starts to suffer at that expense. And so again, a lot of this is sort of, think of it as sort of market research, but don't spend so much time that you're not able to actually spend time reflecting on your own personal story and thinking about how you want to talk about it. Next up, testing. So for many folks, and I'd be curious actually to get a sense from the chat here, are folks preparing right now for the GMAT or the GRE? Have you already wrapped up testing? If you have, congratulations. But for many folks, for a lot of the folks that I'm working with right now for round one, folks are parallel tracking test preparation with their applications. I know a lot of times folks don't necessarily want to apply to a program or think about schools until they actually have that test score in hand. I would encourage you to think though about, number one, you can't study for the GMAT or the GRE or the EA 24 hours a day. It is important for you to take some breaks and to sort of incorporate other activities. And that, I will say, is really a nice way for folks to be able to start parallel tracking some of that reflection work and that research on schools. So there are ways certainly to parallel track all of this work together. Congratulations. It looks like someone did take their test today. And it looks like we do have a lot of folks prepping right now with TTP. So thank you very much for doing that. But what I will say is, really think about setting time blocking and creating a schedule so that way you can really sort of benefit from both. So carving out time for test preparation, carving out time for school research, and starting to work on those applications, but making sure that you are also building in a buffer so that if you do have to retest, you are able to do so. As I mentioned, one of the reasons that sometimes folks choose to delay their application to round two is because they do want that higher score. Really spend some time and think about, again, how much time you're spending on test preparation, realistically where you think those improvements might come from, and just thinking about the potential ROI there. With regards to essays, so obviously the personal statement is really going to be the big essay for most programs, and that is, in most cases, you're trying to come up with a document that basically tells your story. So why do you want an MBA? What are you going to do with it? What else makes you unique? As a marketer, a lot of the work that I do with clients, we focus on, and we really spend some time talking about this idea of expertise, purpose, and authenticity. As many of you probably know, there is no shortage of representatives from certain industries. You might say that it's a little bit oversaturated in the MBA space. So if you are someone coming from the finance space or from management consulting, not a shock that there's no shortage of folks from those industries who are applying to MBA programs. What I think is really important as you think about, again, about your personal statement, about those supplemental essays, is really starting to think about, number one, what's your expertise? What are 2 or 3 things that you are really, really good at? For a lot of folks, it may be, I'm a wizard when it comes to Excel. I am brilliant at finance. That's why I work in finance. Or maybe if you're a marketer, maybe you're great at storytelling. Maybe that's your superpower. But the reality is that those things that we're experts at are typically going to be things that thousands of other people are experts at as well. And that's where the purpose and authenticity comes in. And this is really where, as I keep talking about sort of the importance of reflecting and spending this time thinking about how to position your story. This is where this idea of purpose and authenticity comes in. So purpose is really, what drives you, what gets you out of bed in the morning. And while a lot of my finance clients will be the first to tell me that finance absolutely gets them out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, I think the reality is that for many folks, there are other things that are driving them that aren't necessarily a part of what they do in their day-to-day job, but that might be driving a potential career pivot into a new industry. And so I encourage you, if that's describing you, spending some time really thinking about what does drive you, what gets you out of bed in the morning. And especially if you're thinking about pivoting from one industry to another, thinking about what are those drivers that are doing just that are driving this career shift and this industry shift. If you're thinking about being an entrepreneur, and for many folks, obviously the MBA is a catalyst for entrepreneurship, really thinking about what is the purpose behind the company or companies that you're building or hoping to build in the future. Is there a common thread that is very purposeful, that is very intentional? And if so, what is that? And how does that relate to maybe things that you've either done in the past, whether it be through your undergrad programs or through some of your extracurriculars? Maybe that started as early as undergrad. But when you think about why you have chosen to do the things that you have, why you've chosen the activities that you have, all of these things are going to be incredibly important and intentional when you start thinking about how you tell that story. And then the last piece is the authenticity piece. And honestly, this is probably one of the hardest things for people to wrap their head around because it's asking you to really think about what makes you uniquely you. And that's just a really hard question for a lot of folks. So one of the exercises that I oftentimes will have folks do is to, number one, start asking people in various sort of concentric circles in your life to come up with 3 words or 3 things to describe you. So maybe ask a roommate, or ask a partner or significant other, ask your parents, ask a manager, ask a colleague at work. How would they describe you, maybe in 3 words? And what I think is interesting for many folks is that I think what this exercise oftentimes reveals is that we show up as slightly different versions of ourselves in different circles and in different scenarios. But even though we often do that, there certainly is this there's certainly going to be common threads and commonalities, though, that are found across all of these different sort of representations of ourselves. And that's when you start sort of really getting at this idea of authenticity. What makes you uniquely you? It feels a little counterintuitive sometimes for folks, but it really does make a lot of sense, and it really does sort of explain why we do the things we do, or why we're interested in the things that we are. So again, I encourage you to spend some time thinking about expertise, purpose, authenticity. Definitely spend time taking a look at, especially if you're looking at pivoting into a new career space, really thinking about and spending time researching what that new pathway is going to look like, and being able to back it up with very specific examples in your essays about how that program is going to help you achieve success and where you plan on going with that, both in the short term as well as the long term. Next up is resume. So I will tell you right now, this is probably one of the most overlooked pieces of the application. And in reality, it really is one of the most important things. When I read applications, the first thing that I do, actually, before I ever look at anyone's test scores or their personal statement or essays, is I take a look at their resume. And one of the reasons is because the resume really gives the admissions committee a roadmap for what you have done in your professional career. So it's a 1-page snapshot of everything that you've done, and more importantly, the results that you've been able to drive. And so think of the resume as your opportunity to really sort of be this sort of personal brag sheet, or be this roadmap to show someone what is everything that you've been able to accomplish since college, both professionally as well as through an extracurricular lens. One of the biggest mistakes that folks make is that they think that just because they've landed great jobs using one version of the resume, they can use that resume for business school. And I am here to tell you that that is absolutely not the case. An MBA resume is going to be very, very different from a professional resume. And one of the main reasons is that a professional resume, the goal of the professional resume is to land a job, an industry-specific job. And when you think about that, the way that you tell your story in that professional resume is going to be to basically convince a hiring manager, to convince an HR person that you have certain skills and experiences that qualify you, for a particular job. Whereas an MBA resume is really designed to sort of show holistically what this pathway has looked like. So what are the results that you've been able to drive? How have you been able to do it? What was the impact? And you should really be able to look at the resume and be able to see what is the journey this person has been on, essentially. There are things that I think in terms of do's and don'ts, in terms of what to include on resume, and I'll put in a shameless plug. We did a resume workshop a few months ago, so I would highly encourage folks to check it out, and where we do some before and afters for different industry specific roles and bullet points. But I think some of the other quick things just on resume that I would make sure that you think about are, number one, if you have less than 3 years of work experience, and if you have relevant experience from college. And what I mean by that is if you have strong internship experience that aligns with your current field, certainly feel free to include that. Make sure, though, that the number of bullets that you have is going to be commensurate with the amount of time you spent in a role. And what I mean by that is if you have been in a current role for 12 months or 18 months, you should not have the same number of bullets for that role as you do for a 3-month internship. And so really, this is a lot of good resume writing is an exercise in being concise, and also being able to recognize what are truly the most important things. And so make sure that as you are piecing together your resume, that you're really being very intentional about how much real estate you're devoting to certain roles. If there are things from college, such as you certainly don't have to include things like the fact that you made the dean's list necessarily. Obviously, do include your course of study, what you majored in, what you minored in, your GPA were relevant, obviously. I would certainly include things like, if there are things that you did that were unique. And so, for example, I do have a lot of folks I work with who, perhaps they played a D1 sport while working part-time and while, achieving a certain GPA. I do think you can certainly include some of those details there where appropriate. It doesn't need to take up a lot of space, but it should be a detail that's mentioned, because I think especially for someone who potentially has played 4 years as a D1 athlete, the amount of the amount of work, number one, that's required is significant. But number two, it is important to be able to show that you were able to balance that, to be able to balance those responsibilities and still execute at a certain level. Also, if you worked in college to help pay for your tuition, that might be a detail to include as well. Again, especially, and this is again for folks who are a little bit lighter on experience, the further away you are from graduation, the less you want to include, because you want your professional experience to really stand on its own. So post-graduation. And then finally, letters of recommendation. So letters of recommendation, as I mentioned, if you're applying round one, you should have already asked your letter writers for those letters of rec. Letters of rec can be a little bit tricky because many schools will ask for slightly different things. And so in some cases, schools are going to have certain word counts. Like HBS is going to be very different from from a handful of other schools. Quite frankly, they just are shorter with fewer. The word count is shorter, and so you want to make sure, number one, that you're highlighting all this for your letter writers, and number two, for any schools that are leveraging the common letter of recommendation that GMAT publishes, this is obviously a nice way to be able to consolidate things a bit. But it is important, I would say, just to make sure that you are giving your letter writers very specific feedback in terms of what are the types of things that you want them to highlight. So what I usually do is I will encourage clients to take a look at a school's mission statement, at their values, and then take a look at very oftentimes the values of the grid that they give in the letter of recommendation, and have them cross-reference those. And so that way you're making sure that your recommenders are going to be highlighting or picking different values, different soft skills to highlight. Obviously, you want to make sure that they're not completely at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So you want to have a little bit of tangential overlap, but you also want to make sure, more importantly, that your letter writers are not being redundant and telling the same stories or highlighting the exact same skills across their letters. So again, I think there certainly is a bit of an art and a science to letters of rec and making sure that they really do work for you. I would encourage you to sort of think about how you want to leverage those in conjunction with your broader application. All right, got a little excited again with the mouse. And then finally, early interview prep. So with a lot of my clients, we have what we call the content parking lot. So as we start doing brainstorming for essays, for letters of recommendation, for everything, there's a lot of content, a lot of stories that are just never going to make it into your application because there's limited real estate. And so one of the things we do is we create what we call the parking lot. So any stories, any examples that don't make it into your essay, into your letters of rec, potentially even your resume, these can sometimes be great things to start a running document that you could potentially leverage as you're thinking about stories to come up with for interviews. And so this is a great document to start, whether you're applying round one or round two. This is just a great running document to have. The next thing I would encourage you to start thinking about as you're wrapping up your applications and as you're doing school research is to start thinking about school research, but through the interview lens. And what that really means is, it boils down to what I call sort of three things here. You have reading, writing, and practicing. And so the reading is certainly going to be stuff like learning about the school and the particular program. But one of the other things that I really encourage folks to think about from a reading perspective is going to the school's newsroom or media center. So learning about what is happening at the broader university at a much wider level. Also creating Google alerts potentially for anything that's related to some of these schools. So that way you're staying abreast and staying on top of current events at these schools. Hint, this will also, in many cases, help you to start developing some smart questions to ask during your interview as well. The other reading part that I encourage folks to do is, and this is going to sound, this will probably sound a little silly in some ways because you're spending a lot of time with your application, but the time that passes between when you submit your application and when you actually interview sometimes can be somewhat significant, especially if you've moved on to other applications. So I do encourage folks to make sure that you are spending time to reread your application, memorizing it, particularly if schools are not doing these interviews blind. And so just making sure that you understand and you remember every aspect of your application, particularly your resume. It's going to be incredibly important. Number two is the writing part. So as I mentioned, starting to think about stories that are going to demonstrate fit with a school, both their academics, their culture. So if you're thinking about Kellogg, trying to write out a couple of stories that really demonstrate how are you a great team player? How have you collaborated with others on a common goal? I think that's certainly going to be something that Kellogg is certainly looking for. And then as you think about some of these other examples, leveraging things like the STAR method or the Carl method to really think about how these stories sort of come to life. And so writing these out potentially in bullets is going to be a great way for you to start practicing. And then last but not least, the practice piece again is just that. So making sure that you're not just reading your notes, but that you are practicing with a friend or doing mock interview with someone who has worked in admissions, for example. Or if you are looking to do this on your own, recording yourself and just sort of listening to those recordings and making sure that your stories do make sense, that they're very logical and that you're including everything that you want to highlight. All right. So I know we're starting to run a little bit short on time, so I will jump ahead sort of to our do's and don'ts and wrap ups, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So like I said, a couple of do's and don'ts. So do make sure that you are prioritizing your top preferred programs. And so as part of the research, this is going to be huge. Just making sure that you really do spend some time thinking about of your list of top 10 schools, for example, how are you dividing those up, and which schools are your absolute top priorities to get in round one. Making sure that you are engaging with programs through a variety of events. I always tell folks you can never go to too many info sessions. Chances are you're probably going to hear something similar, but there may be questions or other things that pop up during those conversations that will be valuable. So certainly make sure that you're leveraging those opportunities as much as possible. One of the things that I think sometimes can be overlooked if you haven't done so already, but also just making sure that you are getting your finances in order. And so thinking about how you're going to be paying for your program. Obviously, scholarships and grants are also another one of the advantages of applying early, because once that pot of scholarship money runs out, it's just that it's sort of first come, first serve. So you could be an incredibly compelling applicant, but if all of the scholarship money has been allocated by once you get to round 2 or round 3, really this is more of a round 3 issue. It can certainly be a challenge. And so again, thinking through what are your different funding sources going to be for your program, and again, do scholarships and grants factor into that at all. And then finally, reviewing all of those requirements for letters of recommendation so that there are no rude surprises. I would encourage you to try to give a grid or to give sort of a summary document to all of your letter writers, so that way they understand exactly what they are on the hook for with all those letters. Lastly, don't leave your resume to the last minute. So we talked about this. Make sure that this is something that you're doing in parallel with the rest of your application. The resume really should be, like I said, the roadmap for everything that you have done. Make sure that you're not waiting until the very last minute to submit those applications. I know it comes down to the wire for a lot of folks, but really making sure that you try to give yourself at least a couple of days, or at least 24 hours before that deadline to get those in. And then making sure that you do have someone else review your entire application before it's submitted. There are so many opportunities, for missed articles, for missed things. You spend so much time with every element of your application. It's easy to overlook some of those things. So just making sure that you have someone else with fresh eyes taking a look at your application. And then finally, making sure that you're not giving your letter writers less than a month. So again, trying to give them as much time as possible. Offer to meet with them, offer to walk them through your one pager. As part of that guidance too, do make sure that you actually are giving them a copy of your current resume, and also a one pager that outlines sort of what your reasons and motivations for pursuing business school are, and what your post MBA goals are. A lot of that is going to tie in, and can certainly tie in a very compelling way in the letters that they're writing as well. So making sure that you're giving them as much information as possible so that they can be successful is going to be incredibly important. Great. And then with that, I think that wraps up all of our content for today. So I will take a peek in the chat, and we can certainly turn it over to Q&A if folks have any additional questions. So it looks like we had a couple of questions here about MBA programs, and I know I mentioned a little bit about them earlier. The one thing I would say about MBA programs is, or I guess a couple of things really quickly, is that if you are thinking about MBA, most folks applying to MBA programs are going to have somewhere between 7 and 15 years of work experience. If you're trying to think about, is a full-time program versus a part-time versus an MBA program right for me, I do encourage folks to really think about, what are you trying to get out of the program? I think a big component, when you think about the demographic profile of a lot of the folks in these programs, one of the things certainly to think about is, what type of network are you looking to build? That's oftentimes a big attraction and a big motivator for folks applying to business school. And so thinking about, where are you going to best sort of benefit from that particular network and that particular demographic profile? So definitely take some time to think a little bit about that. But also really thinking about the time and the commitments. Are you able to, full-time obviously means, for most folks, well, for everyone, you're walking away from a full-time job, and your full-time job is going to be the MBA program for 1 or 2 years. For MBA, you're really looking to sort of balance, your full-time work with a program as well. And so thinking about what's going to be the best fit for you. Let's see here. Is it good to add a section about personal professional projects? So absolutely, this is certainly something. So, well, and I don't know about a section per se, but I think that when you think about sort of personal passions, and this can sort of fall in the bucket around extracurriculars. So a lot of folks, for example, who I work with who have entrepreneurial interests, I certainly encourage them, depending on how mature some of these entrepreneurial ventures are, I do encourage them to think about including something in their resume to sort of reflect how much time those ventures have taken. Again, especially if you're thinking about pursuing entrepreneurship after business school. I would make sure, very much like any other job or role, that it is metrics and results oriented. So you are able to share sort of how developed or how mature some of these projects are. For a lot of folks, there's, when you think about just sort of personal passions or interests, there are some of those one-liners that you have at the bottom of your resume. That certainly is going to be a quick and easy way to include some additional interests. But I think when it comes to sort of projects per se and extracurriculars, think about them through the same lens that you would your professional experience. What results have you been able to drive? What story does this help tell in your resume?
Oh, hi. I cannot access the chat to ask a question. I'm not sure why, but I do have a
Sure. Oh,
question.
sure.
So this question is tailored to my personal application. So
Mhm.
my professional experience is primarily in the healthcare field. And while I believe it is very high quality and impactful, I'm concerned about how it might be perceived by the admission committee, given that most of the applicants come from finance or computer science background.
Sure. So what I will say is that I think that I would take a closer look at some of the profiles. You'd be surprised at how many folks with healthcare experience are applying to business schools these days. So you're actually not in, I think, as small of a minority as you think. But really, and what I would encourage you to do, honestly, is I would encourage you to sign up for a consultation, and we can certainly chat more specifically about your situation in particular, and more importantly, what you're thinking about doing after business school. But I think a lot of folks are oftentimes surprised that while finance and consulting are probably the two big industries that everyone thinks about, there are a lot of different industries that are represented in the applicant pool these days. And so it's really more about just being able to show what you've been able to do with the opportunities that you've sort of had, that you've sort of been taken advantage of and that you've pursued. And really, again, through a business lens, what results have you been able to drive in those various roles?
Okay, I'm sorry. To add to that, it is kind of hard to move up the ladder in the healthcare field. There's not much opportunity to get promoted, like if you were in consulting or finance. But I have, like, if somebody has a business experience, or if they founded a business or a nonprofit, will that play a big role when the committee reviews their application?
So again, honestly, it'll depend. It's going to depend kind of on the quality of that experience. So what have you actually been able to do? And so again, I think I don't want to get too bogged down into specifics, because it's really hard to be able to kind of give guidance without sort of knowing a little bit more. But again, I mean, I think it's more important to be able to sort of showcase what are the different things that you have done in your professional career, and be able to sort of share those stories on your resume, and potentially even address them in your essay if they are a significant piece of your professional background.
Thank you so much.
Sure, you're very welcome. So it looks like we had a couple of questions here about interviews. So let's see here. We had some questions on interview timelines. Let's see here. So I think I'll try to wrap these up into one, so some larger guidance around interviews. So we had some questions, it looks like, around timelines and about deciding between round one and round two. And so what I would encourage you to think about is, if you're trying to decide between round one and round two, interview prep is going to be similar in the sense that you'll be trying to prepare for the same types of questions, a lot of behavioral questions, a lot of questions based on your professional experience. What I would say is that a lot of the research that you've already done on the programs, that will come back to help you with interview prep that is school specific. And so I've seen folks prepare for as many as up to 5 interviews in a round, and they've been very, very successful. But again, I think a lot of this also comes down to how much research and how much work folks have done prior to actually submitting those applications as well. Let's see. So we have a couple of questions here on test prep and the amount of time and when they should start prepping. So I will tell you from my time at working at GMAT, I can tell you that the average amount of time that people spend studying for the GMAT is 45 to 60 days. I think that certainly you can do it faster than that. A lot of folks take longer than that. What I would encourage you to think about if you are thinking about a test prep program, though, is making sure that you really inventory sort of where your strengths and weaknesses are, and thinking about, how much time do you need to go back and do some foundational work to shore up some content, or are you looking more at sort of strategy and time management, for example, and then setting out a schedule for yourself that allows you to really tackle test prep in a way that's that's not going to, number one, burn you out, but number two is going to be comprehensive and will build on itself. And so I find that for most folks, 3 to 4 months feels to like it's the sweet spot. Again, I think 45 to 60 can sometimes be a little bit on the shorter side, especially given how busy folks are. But 3 to 4 months usually is kind of the sweet spot, I find, for a lot of folks to be able to really get through content and to be able to sort of shore up some of those time management strategies. I see there's a great question here around extracurriculars, and is it too late to be adding them? What I would encourage you, it does. I mean, I think the optics of adding something, a month or two before you submit an application does look a little disingenuous. It looks like you're just trying to pad your resume. If it has been, and again, I know a lot of folks work in industries where you're working 50, 60, 70 hours sometimes. So it is really, really tough to add extracurriculars. One of the things I do encourage folks to think about is, starting off trying to find some low hanging fruit. So if you work for a company or an organization that has opportunities to maybe volunteer or do some additional work outside of the scope of your current job, whether it's mentoring folks, maybe it's working with an affinity group, start by trying within your organization. Those are usually a little bit of a lighter lift, and they are a little bit easier to manage if you can sort of try and work them into your actual workday as well. See. So let's see, we have some questions about test optional schools as well too. So I think one of the things about test optional that I would just say here is that, if you are applying for the waiver, so just keep this in mind, if you're applying for a waiver or if a school is test optional, just make sure that you have enough other stuff in your application to show that you are going to be able to handle the rigor of a program. So oftentimes, for folks who don't have a great GPA, the GMAT or the GRE can be a great way to sort of demonstrate some of those quantitative those capabilities and those competencies. Again, remember that was the that's exactly the one thing point I was making earlier, that's the one piece of your application you can control a bit more. And so I would encourage you to just sort of think about, if you opt for test optional or applying for a waiver, just make sure that you have enough other data points within your application that really are going to showcase your competencies. So we are at the top of the hour. I know we didn't get to every single question that was submitted, but what I would encourage you to do is, please feel free to visit targettestprep.com. You can sign up for a free 15-minute consultation. If you attach your resume to your request, I'm happy to take a look at your resume and sort of chat more specifically about specific questions that you have. But it was really a pleasure spending some time with you today. Thank you so much, and best of luck to all of you with your applications. And I hope to connect with some of you very soon. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck to you all.
Thank you.